Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. Coming up in this episode, the week ending the 21st of September 1924, Neville Chamberlain savages the Labour Party, no really, and dark warnings are issued to anyone who thinks the state should run hospitals. But first, some of the other items that have caught my attention this week. The Soviet Union is in the process of putting down a revolt in Georgia. There are reports of mass executions and villages being burnt to the ground. There is a controversy over the Prime Minister's new motor car. An industrialist has loaned Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, a certain number of preference shares so that the Prime Minister can use the interest to pay for the vehicle's upkeep. The industrialist in question, Sir Alexander Grant, a childhood friend of MacDonald, has stated that he thought it ridiculous that the Prime Minister should travel by tube. Others are less convinced of the innocence of it all. A Prime Minister travelling by tube? On his own? Unthinkable today. There is fighting near Mecca. This will eventually lead to the creation of Saudi Arabia. After his trip to the front line in Morocco last week, Primo de Rivera has made peace proposals. Things must be going pretty badly. His opponents, still unnamed under the leadership of Abdul Karim, are, in a move that bucks the global trend, thinking of ditching republicanism for monarchy, which they feel, for some reason, will improve their chances of establishing and maintaining independence. The new National Party government in South Africa has decided to sack all the black railway workers and replace them with whites at 3 times the cost. A police raid in Belfast has uncovered a large cache of arms, including a Thompson submachine gun. Oswald Mosley was leader of the British Fascists, but not yet. So who was? By the unanimous vote of the county and area commanders, in all parts of the country, Brigadier General R.B.D. Blakeney has been elected President of the British Fascisti. I would be curious to know where the title Brigadier General comes from. According to Wikipedia, Blakeney left the army with the rank of captain well before the First World War to work on Egyptian railways. And he didn't fight in the war either. I may have the answer. In 1916, British logistics broke down on the Western Front. The Prime Minister, against the initial wishes of Douglas Haig, sent some civilian railwaymen led by a chap called Eric Geddes to sort things out. As they were working within the army, they had to be given an army rank, so they were made brigadier generals, and in Geddes's case, major general. I wonder if something similar happened to Blakeney in Egypt, and that's how he got his rank. Friendly societies were societies that provided voluntary welfare. People would join and make a regular financial contribution, entitling them to sick pay, health care, and an old age pension. In 1911, the state decided to get in on the act, and friendly societies have become approved societies, administering the scheme in weird and wonderful ways that I can't claim to entirely understand. This week, the 25th National Conference of Friendly Societies has been taking place in Oxford. This is from the address of the President, a Mr. J. H. Lear Caton. Whatever the fault of the old club days, there was generally a better spirit existing between the club doctor and the club patient than seemed manifested under the panel practice. Wow. When he talks about the club days, he means before the 1911 Act. So the state got involved, and within 13 years things are getting worse. Personally, he desired to see the great voluntary principle maintained. He did not wish to see hospitals become state or municipal barracks. If only they were run like barracks. With all its drawbacks and disadvantages, the approved society method was preferable to a state-administered scheme. Under the latter, sick claims would tend to increase, and malingering would be found more difficult to check. No kidding. The number of Britons who the state thinks are too sick to work is nowadays numbered in the millions. A French anarchist is to be deported after failing to register under the Aliens Ed Registration Act. He arrived in Britain at the outbreak of the First World War. A woman has been jailed for 3 years after throwing vitriol, that's sulphuric acid to you and me, in the face of her ex-lover. According to the accused, he had promised to marry her and subsequently got her pregnant. From vitriol to ink. Last week I mentioned there's been a spate of ink splashing in London. This week there was an unusual footnote. Arthur Bower, 68, civil engineer of Dorset Street, Portman Square, was charged on remand at Bow Street Police Court yesterday with wilfully damaging a woman's coat, stockings and shoes by splashing ink over them. Mr. Philip Conway, who appeared for Bower, said it was true that he was a notorious gambler, and he once broke the bank at Monte Carlo by winning over £200,000. I'd always wondered what that phrase, break the bank at Monte Carlo, meant. It means, it turns out, that the casino had run out of money. Bower was fined a total of £6. The Académie Française has refused to admit the word cocktail into the French language. Spoiler alert, not for long. Well, not forever at least. A mischievous article has suggested that football will soon overtake bullfighting as Spain's biggest sport. Spoiler alert, in 1929 Spain will be the first international team outside the British Isles to beat England. The All Blacks, the New Zealand rugby union team, are currently touring the British Isles. Each game begins with the performance of a traditional war dance. Clearly there is nothing recent about the Haka. On Monday, the Times published a letter from a Mr. A. Baldwin Raper, chairman of the Anglo-Finnish Society. In all my experiences in many different countries, I have never seen drinking on such a scale as now takes place in Finland. Every description of alcohol, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and often dangerously bad, can readily be purchased at a high price at absolutely every hotel and restaurant of any size anywhere in Finland. From the nation that gave us Kimi Räikkönen. When we think of Neville Chamberlain, if we think of him at all, we either think of the man pathetically waving a piece of paper declaring peace in our time after the sellout at Munich, or the crestfallen one less than a year later resignedly declaring war on Germany. Naive, dull, honest, inadequate. Not the sort of man who could handle himself in a political fight. Well, a report on the speech he made in Birmingham shows another side to him. Referring to the local political situation, Mr. Chamberlain said that the Socialists had now chosen as their champion, instead of their former candidate, not a working man familiar with their trials, hopes and aspirations, but a member of an aristocratic family, Mr. Oswald Mosley. Oswald Mosley has had an interesting career so far. He started off as a unionist/conservative, left them to stand and win as an independent, see the 19th of November 1922 episode, and has now joined the Labour Party, see the 11th of May 1924 episode. By the way, I am not sure a conservative, or anyone else, should be suggesting that an aristocrat cannot understand the lives of the poor, or anyone else. Anyway, back to Chamberlain. It was never possible to anticipate nowadays where socialists would break out. Even the Prime Minister, whose moral sense was revolted by capitalism, nevertheless now saw nothing inconsistent when he accepted from a capitalist the income from £30,000 in order that he might ride in a lordly motor car for the rest of his days. Mr. Mosley, the new candidate, had said recently that the Conservative government created unemployment by pouring out millions of money upon wildcat adventures all round the world. Mr. Mosley, however, failed to quote a single instance, for the reason that they existed solely in his heated imagination. The present government, declared Mr. Chamberlain, had done nothing to check unemployment. Quite true, although there are far fewer demonstrations. A cynic would say that the demonstrations were never intended to help the unemployed, but to embarrass the government. Not only had they utterly failed to find any new scheme that would help employment, in spite of their promises at the last election, but they had, by their wanton and stupid action in repealing the McKenna duties, very considerably added to the number of the unemployed. The McKenna duties were a series of tariffs on imported luxury goods like motor cars, introduced as a wartime measure. The Labour government, in my opinion, was quite right to repeal them, but for sure there was bound to be short-term dislocation. As we were foolish enough to allow foreigners to dump their goods here, quite regardless of the wages they paid or the hours their work people worked, we had not been able to keep our home market for ourselves, and it was this foolishness on our part that had depressed wages. A very modern complaint. I'm not sure about his grasp of economics, but it's an effective political attack. As to rumours of a general election, Mr. Chamberlain said he did not know whether it would come this year. Defeats in the House of Commons made no impression at all upon the thick-skinned government. He was quite certain of this, that the present government would not go to the country if they could help it. They showed no desire to give up their offices. And were pretty certain that when they went to the country they would not come back again to office. The critical time would come when they brought to the House their proposals for the Russian treaty. Mr. MacDonald had been in such a hurry that he had given everything away and got nothing in return. He had undertaken to try to get Parliament to guarantee a loan which only a month before he told the House of Commons he would not guarantee. No wonder there was triumph in Moscow. Nev, are you suggesting that making concessions to hostile powers is a bad idea? Because if you'd stuck to that, it might be your statue in Parliament Square. The treaty, see the 7th of September episode, involves a guaranteed loan to the Soviet Union. In a letter to the Times this week, a correspondent compared the proposed loan to the Soviet Union to the one that was made to Austria in the previous year, and noted that Austria was held to a much higher standard. Back to Chamberlain. If British investors were fools enough to lend themselves to such a transaction, they deserved to lose every penny they put into the loan. He did not know whether the government would be able to escape a dissolution on that question. But if an election came, there was no issue upon which he could go to the country with greater confidence than upon that ridiculous sham, that madness of a treaty which was to hand over to the inhabitants of another country money that we so badly needed ourselves. Anyway, that's all for this week. There were any number of things I would like to have talked about, but due to time, ignorance or sloth didn't get round to. For instance, Mussolini's troubles, well, according to the Times that is, the US and its alleged gold surplus, the Russian army in the war, Gandhi and his critics, Kitchener, the travails of the tramways, and lots of bad news from the Soviet Union. For the time being, all I can say is I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.